Okay. So we started talking about factor market last week, and one of the first things that I started the discussion with is sort of giving you guys an understanding of how factor market is different than product markets. Okay, so far in economics, with all that we've been doing in class, we have really been focusing on the product market, and we looked at the supply and demand and how that works out in the product market, and everything else has been in relation to the product market. But now we're switching gears to the factor market, and so essentially product markets, we saw that this is where households were the buyers of goods and services, right? Households were the ones, we are the on the consumer side, and farms were the sellers of goods and services, and they were on the supply side. Okay. With factor markets or resource markets, the roles are now reversed. It is now households that provide farms with the factors of production that these farms need in order to produce those goods and services. Okay, so households are no longer on the demand side, but they're now on the supply side. Okay, because they are selling the factors of production, and farms are on the buyer on the demand side, because they're the ones that are going to be buying these factors of production from households. Okay. The what are these factors of production that are going to be bought and sold by farms and households? So we looked at them at the very beginning of this course. Like we talked about them briefly. These four things: labor, land, capital, and entrepreneurship. So for the purposes of this class, we're mostly going to be focusing, the factor of production that we're going to focus mostly on is on labor. And yeah, I don't think we're gonna talk about the other three much at all, because this is how even on the college board, which writes the AP exam, um, most of their focus is on the labor market. Okay, so labor, of course, it's just workers. Land, it's like any natural resource that you can use to produce other thing. Capital, we said, it's tools and machines and buildings and all that good stuff. Manufactured goods that you can use to make other things. So land is anything that exists in nature already. Capital would be manufactured goods. And entrepreneurship, it's just somebody that combines all of these other things, and then they can either make something new or modify existing things. Okay. Factor payments are what farms have to pay to hire each one of these types of factors. So they don't, of course, farms have to pay a price because they're obtaining these resources from the households, and the prices that they have to pay are called factor payments. So for labor, the factor payment for labor is wages. The factor payment for land is rent. Factor payment for capital is interest. And for entrepreneurship, you can think of it as profit. Okay, and these prices are entirely determined by the market forces of supply and demand, in the just like we saw in the product side, that the market forces of supply and demand determine the price of product and the quantity, equilibrium price and quantity. It's the same idea here. The prices and quantity will be determined by the market demand and market supply of resources. Then I briefly talked about this circular flow model, which is also something that we saw in the very first lecture. And I introduced this to you guys to sort of um, help you understand how how the product market and factor markets are really sort of interrelated with each other. And you can't really have one without the other, because product market is where goods and services are being sold by farms, and households are also buying these products in the product market from the farms, and households are going to sell factors of production, which are labor, land, and capital, in the factor market to farms, and farms will use these factors of production in order to produce these goods and services that are going to be sold. So the dashed lines are showing the flow of inputs and outputs. So how do inputs and outputs flow in and out of the economy? And the dotted, I'm sorry, not the dotted, the solid arrows are showing flow of money. Okay. Um, so when factor in the factor market or in the farms, right, when farms obtain factors of production from households, they have to pay households something, right? We just saw in on the previous slide that they don't get these factors of production for free. They have to make payments to households for to get these factors of production, and the payments we saw are in the forms of wage, rent, profit, interest, etc., etc. And these payments that the farms make to the households are also the incomes for households, right? So for somebody who is providing labor, they earn wages. For somebody who owns a land, they're gonna get rent on their land. So all of these become incomes for households, which is what the households are going to spend in the product market to buy those goods and services. And the spending by the households is also the revenue for the farms that they earn from selling those goods and services. So all of this is really to show you that we can't really talk about product market without really understanding how things work in the factor market. Once a farm decides how much output they're going to make, they also need to decide how many workers to hire, what is the profit maximizing quantity of workers to hire, and all that. Okay, so this is why it is essential that we understand how the factor markets work as well. So I see the rest of you are here as well. Do you guys have any questions so far? I'm just giving Natalie a brief review of what we talked about on Tuesday. If you have any questions, please make sure to let me know. So then we said that we have these four factors of production, but the one that we're mostly going to focus on is on labor, and hence we're talking about the labor market. But the one type of labor market that we started our discussion with is with perfectly competitive labor market. So you can assume from here that there are other types of labor markets as well, which is not perfectly competitive. So just like we saw in product market side, there is perfect competition, there is monopoly, there is monopolistic competition, there's oligopoly. There is something not quite similar, but there is a similar idea in in resource market as well. Okay, so there is imperfect competition in the resource market as well. So then when we said that this is what we're going to start our discussion with, the perfectly competitive labor market, and these are some of the assumptions that we made about the perfectly competitive labor markets, is that there are many small farms that are hiring many workers that have identical skills and abilities. So in a sense, the workers that are selling their the resources are pretty much the same, they're identical. And no, because there are so many small farms, no one farm is large enough to manipulate the market. So they don't really have any type of market power. What that really boils down to is that individual farms in the perfectly competitive labor market are what called wage takers. Okay, remember when we talked about perfect competition, we saw that perfectly competitive markets, or in the product side, they were price takers. So here they're wage takers. And what is wage really? It is the price of labor, right? So here also, as you can sort of understand from this analogy, individual farms are also price takers in one essence, because the price of labor is wage. So farms, the because we're talking about perfect competition, perfectly competitive labor market, the wage the wage rate is constant. Okay, it's a fixed sort of wage. Okay, and that is determined essentially by the market demand and market supply of labor. And when the market demand and market supply of labor, they intersect with each other, there is a wage rate that is determined, and that is the wage that individual farms sort of have to accept as the wage rate. Okay, so if you take a look at this graph, sorry, these two side-by-side graphs here, so this is the perfectly competitive product market, and this is the perfectly competitive labor market. Okay, uh, as we saw, know this graph by now, like really well, right? Um, the intersection of supply and demand in the product market gives us equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity. And in the factor market, the intersection of the supply of labor and the demand of labor gives us this thing, this which is the equilibrium wage and equilibrium quantity. So how many workers will be hired at this wage rate? So this is what the intersection of supply and demand of labor basically tells us in the factor market. Okay, so this is the, remember that this is the market graph. Okay, market as we saw in product side, on product side, right? The market graph and the farms graph look different than each other, but the takeaway from here is that this individual farms, just like we saw on product market side, the individual farms there were price takers. So individual farms are also going to be price takers, or as we know, wage takers. Okay, that is a more appropriate term, I guess. They're wage takers. They have to accept the market wage rate as given, and they can hire as many workers as they want at the wage rate that has been set by the industry. They don't have to raise wages in order to attract more workers, and they can't lower wages either, because if you try to lower the wage below the market wage rate, all the workers would just go to some other guy who's at least going to be paying them the market wage rate for their skills and abilities. Okay, so then then we looked at the demand for labor, which is how many workers, different, or the different quantities of workers that the businesses are willing and able to hire at different wage rates. So for the demand curve for labor, the labor demand curve for an industry is an downward sloping curve. Okay, it's a downward sloping line, and we have wage on the vertical axis and labor on the horizontal axis. And from here, because as you can see that the farms are the ones that are going to be demanding this labor, if the wage rate increases, right, we go from W2 to W1, the quantity demanded of labor is higher, so the L1 is right here. And if wage rate were to drop, the quantity demanded increases. Okay, so vice versa. If it were to go the other way around, we would see that going from W2 to W1, the quantity of labor would go down. Okay, and then so this is just one, we just established what demand for labor is. It is essentially how we relate wage to labor, right? So what is the different quantities of labors that are going to be hired at different wage rates? Okay, and in order for us to be able to understand what is the profit maximizing quantity of labor to hire, okay, in order for us to be able to do that, what we really need to understand is how valuable a worker is to a farm. Okay, so how much value an additional worker brings to a business. Okay, and we do that with this concept, which is called the marginal revenue product of labor. Okay, and it is exactly as it you should understand from the name. Okay, so it's the addition to a farm's revenue when an additional worker is hired. Okay, and the formula for the marginal revenue product of labor we saw was this thing, which is the change in total revenue divided by the change in labor. And we saw that with some manipulation of this formula, we arrived at this thing, right? So the marginal revenue product of labor is essentially just a product of marginal revenue times the marginal product of labor. Okay, so we just looked at it on a table, and how we can calculate the marginal revenue product. And what is it that this marginal revenue, why do we care about this, and how does it relate to our overall I guess conversation. Okay, so we said that we are going to be, we assume that we're talking about a bakery which sells loaves of breads, and the bakery can hire anywhere between 0 to 6 workers, and this is the total product. Okay, so basically one worker can make 6 breads, and 2 workers together they can make 11 breads, 3 workers together can make 15 breads, and on and on. So this is their total product. And then we found the marginal product, which is the change in quantity divided by the change in labor. And then what we did here is, aside from assuming that we are talking about a perfectly competitive labor market, we also assume that we're talking about a perfectly competitive product market, which basically is to give us or take us back to this thing, right? So in perfectly competitive product market, right, the price was constant, right? And then we saw that the marginal revenue was always going to be equal to the price. Okay, so by doing this, marginal revenue equals to price, I was able to rewrite this thing as, so remember from the previous slide, we said that marginal revenue product of labor is marginal revenue times marginal product of labor. I'm just going to, uh, instead of writing marginal revenue, I'm just going to rewrite it as price times the marginal product of labor. Okay? So basically, what this thing really tells us is that because it is the price of the product, right? So the price that you sell the product for times the marginal product of labor. So this is how much. So this marginal revenue product of labor is essentially, it tells us how much a farm would be willing to, like the maximum amount that the farm would be willing to pay to hire each worker. Okay, because let's say for the first worker, okay, they add 6 loaves of bread to the total production, and I can sell each loaf of bread for $12. I'm sorry, for $2. Okay, so in essence, he is earning $12, or he is adding $12 in revenue to the farm. So this $12 is what I'd be willing to pay to hire this first worker. This is exactly how much he adds to the total revenue for the farm. Okay, so what the reason that we care about this marginal revenue product of labor, and we went through all this calculation to find these numbers, is because it allows me, or it, what I see from here is that if this is the maximum wage that I'm going to be willing to pay per worker, it is essentially the same as the demand for labor, because demand for labor does the same thing. Okay, it tells me the same thing, it is, which is at different wage rates, how many workers am I going to be willing to hire? So the marginal revenue product of labor is also telling me the same thing. And I can, the reason I do this is because I can sort of put dollar values in this. Okay, I can see, I can put a dollar term, I guess, for how much additional revenue each worker brings to me. So this is why we go through this trouble of understanding and calculating this marginal revenue product of labor. Okay. All right. So for the first worker, the maximum I'm going to pay him is 12. For the second worker, the maximum I'm going to be willing to pay him is 10. And for the third, it's 8, and on and like this, which then just becomes the demand for labor at different wage rates. Okay. Any question?
No.
So that was all that we talked about last week. So today we're going to start talking about the supply of labor. Okay. So we looked at the demand side. So the supply side, remember, This is the demand side is, farms are, how much farms are willing and able to pay, right? Different, uh, willing and able to hire at different wage rates, right? How many workers they're willing and able to hire at different wage rates. And for the supply side, it's the number of workers that are willing and able to work at different wage rates. Okay, so if demand is like willingness to pay, right? So for supply of labor, it is like willingness to accept. So this labor supply curve, for any industry, it will be upward sloping, which comes from the law of supply, because here, right, the vertical axis and the horizontal axis, they're measuring the same thing, right, which is wage rate, and labor, and at different wages, how many workers are willing and able to work. Okay, so if the wage is high, right, at W2, L2 workers are willing and able to work. If the wage rate was lower at W1, only L1 workers are willing and able to hire. So which gives us an upward, once we connect these dots, an upward sloping labor supply curve for the industry. Okay. So that was what we just saw right now, right? So this is the labor supply curve for an industry, which is upward sloping. Okay. But for the farm, for the individual farm, right, the um, graph looks a little bit different. Okay. What I want you to remember back to is the assumptions that we made about the individual farms and how they are wage takers in a perfectly competitive labor market. So they are so small compared to the entire market that they don't really have any way to manipulate the market wage rate. So they take this market wage rate that was determined at the market as sort of given. Okay, so I know it's not going to be over here. So let me just redraw this a little bit. So we know that the market wage rate is going to be somewhere up here. This would be All Star. Okay, so imagine that, this is the same wage rate, just like we did in perfectly competitive product markets, right? It's the same idea here. The market wage rate that has been determined in the market by the by the interaction of demand and supply of labor, right? The individual farms have to take this market wage rate as given. So they have a perfectly elastic labor supply. Okay, so they can hire as many workers as they want at this market wage, but they wouldn't be able to lower their wage, remember, because the workers would just go to another firm, in this perfectly competitive labor market, who would be willing to pay them at least this W star. Okay, and they have no need to increase the wage rate because they can hire as many workers as they want at this fixed market decided wage rate. Okay. And what I want you to remember is that this is only this situation applies to the perfectly competitive labor markets only. When we look at the other type of imperfectly competitive labor market, we will see that, of course, this labor supply curve is not going to be perfectly elastic for them. Okay. Any question?
No.
All right. So the same way that we looked at the demand side, right? We had tried to understand from like a business's perspective, um, why is it that businesses hire workers, right? They don't hire them because it makes them feel good. They don't hire them because it's the socially like great thing to do, right? It's nothing of that sort. They hire people because these people are gonna help them produce the outputs that they're going to sell, right? They want to maximize profit. So in order for them to make the decision about how much, first they have to understand, first they have to know how many outputs they're going to make, and they also have to decide how many workers do I really need in order to make that many outputs. Like, what is the profit maximizing quantity of workers to hire? Okay, and that is exactly the number of workers that they're going to hire. So when we talked about demand for labor and marginal revenue product of labor, so we looked at one side of the equation, which is uh, the revenue side. So how much does each how much revenue, how much total, or sorry, how much additional revenue does um, each additional worker bring to the farm? Okay, so now we're going to look at the cost side, and the flip side of that, of this marginal revenue product of labor, is the marginal factor cost. Okay, which is exactly how much, or measure of what the next unit, or the next worker is going to cost to the farm. Okay, because it's not enough just to understand uh, the additional revenue that the next worker is going to bring me. I also have to make sure that I compare it to the additional cost that this next worker that I hire is going to cost me. Okay, which is where the marginal factor cost comes in. And I hope you guys like sort of see from all this discussion that the ideas are sort of similar, right? We talked about marginal cost, we talked about marginal revenue, but those were in terms of the product. Okay, here we are talking about everything is specifically related to the factors themselves. Okay, so the marginal factor cost, as I said, it's a measure of what the next unit of an input costs to the firm. So marginal factor cost of labor is just the change in total cost, uh, divided by the change in labor. Okay. So this is what it looks like on the table. The labor inputs, right, can go from, so these are the number of people you can hire, anywhere from 0 to 7. And because we assumed a perfectly competitive labor market, we see that the wage rate is constant. Okay, so no matter if you hire person, of course the wage rate, of course, that's different. The rate is determined by the market. If you hire one person, it's still same. Two people, it's still six. Three people, still six. No, if you don't really, what we see here is that I don't really have to increase the wage that I pay my workers in order to hire more people. Okay, some we will see that when we talk about imperfectly competitive labor markets. Some markets have to do that, but not in perfectly competitive labor market. Okay, so this is perfectly competitive labor markets. No matter how many workers you hire, you can all pay them all the same wage rates. Okay, so how do I find the total factor cost? Okay, so the one only factor here is labor, right? So I just, what do? I just multiply these two things, right? So labor input times the wage rate gives me the total cost. So for the first person, right, if I only hire one person and I have to pay them $6, the total cost is $6. If I hire two workers, and I have to pay each one of them $6, altogether the total factor cost is $12. So like this is how we're doing this. Okay. And then the marginal factor cost, it's basically the same thing that we have been doing. Anytime you have to do marginal of anything, I hope you guys know how to do that by now. Okay. So the marginal factor cost, let's see, for the fourth worker, how did I get 6? Elias, how do I get this?
You do 24 minus 18.
Very good. Divided by, it's just 4 minus 3, which is the change in labor, or 1, right? Which gives me 6. Good. So it's the same principle, everywhere that we have been doing any type of marginal, cost, marginal revenue, marginal analysis, basically. Okay, so the change in total divided by the change in total factor cost divided by the change in labor. Okay. So what we see here, and what is interesting here, is that this marginal factor cost, this number is it's the same, for every single labor input, and it's the same as the wage rate. Okay, it's 6 every time. And just like I said before, this is only because we're assuming that we are in a perfectly competitive labor market, because this basically comes from the wage rate being constant. Okay, so the total, every time you are multiplying by 1 times 6, 2 times 6, the change is always this 6. Okay, so that's why the marginal factor cost is equal to the wage rate, only in perfectly competitive labor market. So this is why we were able to draw this graph, and where the wage rate is equal, the equilibrium or the market wage rate is equal to $6, and we know that this is the perfectly elastic short run supply of labor for the individual farm, which is also equal to the marginal factor cost. And these three things, right there, the marginal factor cost is the same as the wage. Okay, so always remember that this is only when it comes to perfectly competitive labor market. Okay, do you guys have any question about this, or how we got these numbers, or why any of this makes sense or not doesn't make sense? Hello?
No.
No. Joseph, do you understand how we got this?
Yes.
Okay, great. All right. So what is the point of all this? Why we have been doing this, understanding this demand for labor, supply of labor, this MRP, this MFC, like, well, I don't really, the farms don't really care about understanding all this nitty-gritty, right? They want to know what is the profit maximizing quantity of, factors basically to hire. So how many workers should I hire that will maximize my profit? Okay, and the way they do that, it's the same idea that we have been following all along. Okay, so remember, the profit maximizing quantity, right, for farms to produce is where, if the marginal revenue was equal to marginal cost, right? So that was the profit maximizing quantity to produce, or this is how much farms should choose to produce. If MR was greater than MC, did we do more or less? Did we produce more or less? Did we keep producing or stop?
We keep producing.
Yeah, right, because you can still add, right, more to your profit, right, by keep producing. If MR was less than MC, we do or did less, right? We should do less. And if MR was equal to MC, we said that you do it and then you stop, because this is the profit maximizing quantity. Okay, so this, we can take this same idea and just apply it in the context of the labor market. It's just the terms are now a little bit different. Instead of MR and MC, we have the marginal revenue product of labor, and then the factor. This should be like MFC. If this helps you understand it better, just think of it as the MFC. The reason we have MRC here is because sometimes the marginal factor cost, also known as marginal resource cost. So this is why some textbooks will write it as MRC, some textbooks will write it as MFC. So for the sake of keeping everything the same, we're gonna go with MFC, the marginal factor cost. Okay, so for the profit maximizing quantity of workers to hire for firms in perfectly competitive labor market is this. Okay, it's when you are going to hire workers, okay, until your marginal revenue product of labor is equal to your marginal factor cost of labor, because essentially this is the cost of hiring an additional person, additional worker. And what is this? This is essentially like the benefit or the revenue from extra work. So you want those two things to be equal to each other, because if the benefit was greater than the cost, you would keep hiring more people. If the benefit was less than the cost, it means that you have hired too much. You should fire a few people, maybe, right? So you have hired too much and now your costs are greater. Okay, it's at this point, so you should only hire, okay, you should hire workers until you get to this point where they're equal to each other, because that means that you're this is when you have hired the profit maximizing quantity of workers. Okay. And this table right here is basically I have taken from the previous slides. Okay, we saw this table earlier when we were talking about the marginal revenue product of labor, and the reason that we're looking at this is because so that you can see from this table what is the profit maximizing quantity of labor to hire. So what is that quantity, you guys? How many workers should I hire? So what is the rule?
When the marginal revenue product is equal to the marginal factor cost.
Yes, so that happens, and I have highlighted it here, right? At 4 units of labor, right? Because at 1, 2, and 3, the marginal revenue product of labor is greater than the marginal factor cost, right? Which is that thing is constant, right? But then here at 1, it's 12. Here at 2 units of labor, it's 10. At 3, it's 8. But by the time we get to 4 units of labor, they're equal to each other. Okay, so should you hire the 5th person? No, because why not?
Because the factor cost, the marginal factor cost is greater.
Exactly. So the additional, if you hire that 5th person, right, the additional cost of hiring that extra person is $6, but they're only going to add $4 in revenue to the firm. So it makes no sense to hire that 5th person because they're going to cost you more then they bring in revenue. Okay, so you should only hire 4 people and then you stop. Okay, so this is the profit maximizing rule of labor employment. All right, and then this is sort of, I just wanted to make sure that I showed you guys in a graph. So this is the perfectly competitive labor market. This graph that we saw earlier, I gave you a side-by-side comparison of the perfectly competitive product market and the perfectly competitive labor market. So that was the market side. And now we just see these two market and farm graphs side by side in when it comes to perfectly competitive labor market. Okay, and profit maximizing farms, right, will hire factors of production up to the point where these two things are equal to each other. So this is where the number of the equilibrium quantity of labor that would be hired is at this quantity L star. Okay, because this is where, so remember the demand curve, that is the marginal revenue product of labor. The supply curve is the marginal factor cost of labor, and where they intersect, this is the profit maximizing factor of production to hire. Okay. Any question, you guys? Anything about you don't understand, like why we're doing this or why we're doing that? No. Okay, then this is as far as I wanted to cover for today. Next week